The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dry, dusty plains. A lone cowboy rode his horse along the narrow dirt road, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. His face was weathered, roughened by the years of wandering, and his eyes, though distant, held the marks of a life filled with pain and loss. His name was Jack Carter, but no one called him that anymore. People simply called him the Drifter, for that was all he had become, a man without a past, a man without a future. Jack had once been a lawman, a man who had worked hard to bring justice to a land that was often unjust. But that was before the tragedy, before the moment that had torn his world apart. He had lost his family, his home, and the very purpose that had driven him for so long. Now, he traveled from town to town, looking for something he couldn't quite name. Redemption, perhaps, or just an escape from the ghosts that haunted him. Either way, he wasn't sure if he was running towards something or away from it. On this particular evening, as the orange glow of the setting sun bathed the world in a warm, fading light, Jack came upon a small town. It was the kind of place he had passed through 100 times before: empty, dusty streets, ramshackle buildings, and the smell of sweat and hard labor in the air. But there was something different about this town, something in the air that made Jack's heart beat a little faster. Maybe it was the silence that hung over the place, or maybe it was the look in the eyes of the people he passed. They seemed to be waiting for something, something they didn't have, something they needed. And maybe, just maybe, Jack could be the one to give it to them. As Jack dismounted from his horse, he felt the weight of the journey on his shoulders. His legs were stiff from hours of riding, and his back ached from the long days spent in the saddle. He hadn't had a proper meal in days, and his canteen was nearly empty. But none of that mattered. He had a job to do, or at least that's what he told himself. He had to find a place to sleep for the night, get something to eat, and move on. He couldn't stay in one place for too long. The longer he stayed, the more likely it was that someone would recognize him, and that was a risk he couldn't afford to take. Jack wandered down the main street of the town, looking for the saloon. It was the one place where drifters like him could find shelter, food, and a drink. He had no intention of getting involved with anyone, just a quick stop to rest, and then back on the road. But as he neared the saloon, something caught his attention. A small voice, barely a whisper, called out to him from behind a weathered fence. "Sir, can you help us?" Jack turned to see a young girl standing by the fence, her face barely visible through the slats. She was small, maybe no older than 12, with long brown hair that had been tangled by the wind. Her clothes were ragged, and her eyes, wide and full of fear, locked onto his with a desperate plea. "Please, sir, can you help us?" she repeated, her voice trembling. Jack took a step closer, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't used to being approached like this, especially not in a town like this. He'd heard all sorts of stories about what happened to drifters who got involved in other people's problems. But there was something in the girl's eyes, a raw vulnerability that stirred something deep inside him. He couldn't just walk away, not this time. He crouched down to her level, keeping his voice low and calm. "What's your name, little one?" The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering nervously. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Thompson." Jack studied her face, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had seen his share of troubled children, but there was something different about Sarah, she seemed. Alone, and that was never a good sign in a town like this. "What's going on, Sarah?" he asked softly. "Why are you out here by yourself?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she took a shaky breath before answering. "It's my mom, sir. She's really sick. She's been sick for a long time, and we don't know what to do. We don't have any money for a doctor, and I don't know who else to ask." Jack's heart softened at the girl's words. He could see the pain in her eyes, the fear of losing someone she loved, the helplessness of not knowing how to fix it. He had been there before, in a way. He had lost everything once, but this girl, this young soul, had the courage to ask for help, and that made all the difference. "Where's your mom, Sarah?" Jack asked gently. "At home," she said, her voice breaking. "In the cabin just outside town." Jack stood up slowly, glancing back at the saloon. He knew he couldn't go there now, not with this girl's words still echoing in his mind. He had to help. He had to at least try. "I'll come with you," he said. "Lead the way." Sarah's face lit up with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as though she hadn't expected anyone to help. She nodded quickly and started walking, her steps light and quick as if she couldn't believe her luck. Jack followed close behind, his boots kicking up the dust of the town as he moved. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of the dry earth beneath their feet. The town soon faded behind them, and they found themselves walking along a narrow path that led toward a small cabin on the edge of a field. The cabin was modest, with peeling paint and a sagging roof, but it had a sense of quiet warmth to it. It was the kind of place that had seen better days but still held on to whatever life had once been there. As they approached the cabin, Sarah's pace slowed and she glanced nervously at Jack. "Mom's really sick," she said again, as if reminding herself. "I don't know if she's going to make it." Jack felt a lump form in his throat at her words. He had no idea what he could do, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't leave. Not now. When they reached the door, Sarah knocked softly and a faint voice called from inside. "Is that you, Sarah?" "It's me, Ma," Sarah replied, her voice full of both relief and fear. "I brought someone to help." The door creaked open, revealing a woman lying on a bed inside. She was thin, pale, and covered in a blanket that looked too large for her frail frame. Her face was flushed with fever, and her eyes were closed as if she were lost in a deep sleep. But as soon as she heard Sarah's voice, she opened her eyes and smiled weakly. "Who's this, darling?" she asked softly, her voice raspy. "This is Jack," Sarah said, turning to the cowboy. "He's here to help." Jack stepped forward, his eyes meeting the woman's. She looked tired, broken, and in need of more than just medicine. He could see it in her eyes, the hopelessness, the quiet acceptance that she might not have much time left. "I'm not sure what I can do," Jack said honestly, "but I'll do what I can." The woman nodded faintly, as if she had already come to terms with her fate. "Any help is better than none," she whispered. Jack stood there for a moment, unsure of where to start. But then, as he looked down at Sarah, he realized something. The girl had come to him for help, not because she thought he could save her mother, but because she had nowhere else to turn. And that was enough for him. It was enough for him to try. Jack watched as Sarah gently settled her mother back onto the bed. The woman's eyes were barely open, and her breath came in shallow, labored gasps. It was clear she was hanging on by a thread, but Jack wasn't sure how long that thread would last. The sight of her pale, frail form stirred something deep inside him, a feeling he hadn't had in years. Compassion. He had lost that part of himself long ago, but here, in this quiet cabin with this sick woman and her desperate daughter, it began to return. He turned to Sarah, who stood near the doorway, wringing her hands nervously. "What happened to her?" Jack asked, his voice gentle, trying not to sound too harsh. He didn't want to overwhelm the girl with too many questions, but he needed to know what he was dealing with. Sarah looked down at the ground, her small shoulders slumping under the weight of her worries. She had the look of someone who had spent too many nights awake, worrying, praying for help, but never receiving it. "She got sick a while ago," Sarah started, her voice quiet, almost as if she were talking to herself. "At first it was just a cough, a little fever, but then it got worse. She started coughing up blood, and I didn't know what to do. We couldn't afford a doctor, and no one would come out here to help us." Sarah's voice cracked, and she wiped her eyes quickly, as if not wanting Jack to see her tears. Jack felt the familiar ache in his chest, the kind he had experienced when his own family had died, helplessness. There was no one to blame here, no enemy to face, just life and death. And sometimes life didn't care what you did or how hard you tried. He took a deep breath, forcing his mind to focus. "I'll do what I can," Jack said, his tone steady but full of conviction. He wasn't sure what he could do yet, but he wouldn't leave until he tried everything. The cowboy had known his share of hardships, but the sight of this woman, helpless in the face of her illness and the emptiness of her small cabin, was something that hit too close to home. He had to do something. He had to help. The girl nodded quickly, her eyes wide with relief. Thank you so much." She whispered the words almost as if she couldn't believe he was actually here, offering help when no one else had. Jack gave a small nod in return, his gaze turning back to the woman in the bed. He needed to focus on her now, to figure out how to get her through the night and, hopefully, the days after that. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the sky was growing dark. The cool evening air crept in through the cracks in the cabin's walls. Jack closed the door behind him, trying to keep the chill at bay. It wasn't much of a cabin, just a small, one-room structure with a bed in one corner, a rickety wooden table, and a few shelves lined with jars of food and other necessities. The only warmth came from the flickering fire in the hearth, which crackled as Jack walked toward the woman. He knelt beside the bed, his rough hands gently feeling her forehead. She was burning up with fever, her skin damp with sweat. Jack knew there were no simple solutions to a fever like this. It was likely some sort of infection, but it could have been anything: pneumonia, tuberculosis, or worse. There was no way to be certain without proper medicine, and they had none. Jack felt a pang of frustration. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't even a healer, but he knew the land better than most. He had spent years surviving in the wild, learning from his mistakes, understanding the plants and herbs that could help or hurt. If there was anything in this world that might save this woman, he would find it. "I'll need to go out for a while," Jack said to Sarah, standing up and brushing his hands on his pants. "I know of a few places nearby where some herbs grow. Maybe something out there can help." Sarah looked up at him, her face filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. She had seen so many men ride into town, promising to help and never returning. But Jack wasn't like the others. She could see that in the way he carried himself, in the steadiness of his voice. He wasn't just a drifter, he was a man of his word. "I'll be careful, Sarah," Jack said, trying to reassure her. "Don't worry, just keep her comfortable while I'm gone." With that, he turned and headed out the door, leaving Sarah alone with her mother. The night air was cool against his skin, and the stars were scattered across the sky like tiny jewels. Jack walked through the dry, cracked earth toward the hills beyond the cabin, where he knew some medicinal herbs grew. He had seen them in the past, but he had never needed them until now. The moon was a thin crescent, casting just enough light for Jack to see the path ahead. His boots crunched against the ground as he moved steadily, his mind focused on the task at hand. He had no time to waste. Every moment that passed was one where the woman in the cabin could grow weaker, slipping further away. As he walked, Jack thought about his own life, his own struggles. How had it come to this? He had once been a man who stood for justice, a man who had lived by a code. But after the deaths of his family, he had let that code slip away. The world had taken everything from him, and he had let it. But now, here he was, standing on the edge of a hill in the middle of nowhere, trying to save the life of a stranger he had only just met. Maybe this was the redemption he had been looking for all along. It wasn't long before Jack reached the spot he was searching for. The hill was covered in thick brush, and a few small trees grew haphazardly along the slopes. In the distance, the sound of the wind whispered through the trees, and the night was so still it felt as though the whole world had paused in anticipation. Jack crouched down and began searching through the undergrowth. He knew what he was looking for: several plants that could help reduce fever and fight infection. He moved carefully, pulling the herbs from the earth with a steady hand, making sure to take only what he needed. As he worked, his mind kept returning to Sarah and her mother. The woman's pale face flashed in his mind, and he wondered if he was wasting his time. Would these herbs be enough to help her, or was it too late? Jack didn't know, but he couldn't give up. He wouldn't give up, not when there was still a chance. After gathering the herbs, Jack made his way back to the cabin. It was much later now, and the night was deep, but he didn't mind. He had been through worse. When he arrived back at the cabin, Sarah was sitting by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mother was still in the bed, her breathing still shallow but steady for the moment. Sarah looked up as Jack entered, her eyes lighting up with hope. "I found something," Jack said, holding up the herbs. "I think it'll help. Let me get started on it." Sarah nodded quickly, her face flushed with relief. "Thank you, Jack. I don't know what we would have done without you." Jack didn't say anything in return. He simply moved toward the bed and began to prepare the herbs, boiling them in water over the fire to create a tea that he could give to the woman. He worked quickly, his hands steady, as the fire crackled in the background. The woman stirred slightly as the scent of the boiling herbs filled the room. Jack gently lifted her head, pouring a small amount of the liquid into a cup and carefully bringing it to her lips. She drank it slowly, her face scrunching as the bitter taste hit her tongue. Jack watched her closely, his heart in his throat. This was all he could do. He had no more answers, no more remedies. All he had was the hope that this would work. Sarah watched her mother, her eyes full of anxious anticipation. Jack could see the worry in her gaze, the kind of worry that only a daughter could have for her mother. The room was filled with a tense silence as the minutes ticked by, and Jack found himself holding his breath. Would it work? The fire flickered softly in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls of the small cabin. Jack sat by the fire, his gaze fixed on the woman lying in the bed. Her breathing had slowed, but it was still shallow, and her pale face showed no sign of improvement. He had been watching her for hours, waiting for something to change, hoping for a sign that the herbs he had gathered would work. Sarah sat beside her mother, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes darting between Jack and her mother. She hadn't spoken much since Jack returned with the herbs, but Jack could see the quiet desperation in her eyes. She was holding onto a thread of hope, but he could see how thin that thread was becoming. Jack had spent much of his life trying to numb the pain of loss, but something about this situation, this woman, this girl, was pulling him in deeper than he had expected. He had no family left, no ties to anything, and yet, as he watched Sarah's quiet anguish, he felt a responsibility he hadn't felt in years. He had come here to help, but now he wasn't sure if he could. The night had grown quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of the wind outside. Jack's body ached from the long hours he had spent in the saddle earlier, but he couldn't bring himself to sleep. His mind was too restless, too filled with thoughts of what might happen if this woman didn't make it. He had seen death before, on the battlefield, in the wilderness, and even in the eyes of people he once called friends, but it had never been this close. He had never felt this sense of helplessness. The woman in the bed was a stranger, but to Sarah she was everything, and Jack couldn't let her lose her mother, not like this. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. Jack finally stood and walked to the door, stepping outside for a moment to clear his head. The cold night air hit him sharply, but it helped to calm his racing thoughts. The stars overhead were bright and clear, twinkling in the vastness of the sky. It was a peaceful sight, but there was no peace in Jack's heart. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, about how much she needed her mother, and how little he could offer her in return. He ran a hand through his hair and stared out into the dark landscape. The hills around them seemed to stretch on forever, and for a moment Jack thought about leaving, about getting back on his horse and riding away. He had done it before. When things got too heavy, too complicated, he had always been able to just walk away. But something about this place, about these people, was different. Jack turned back toward the cabin and walked inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He looked at Sarah, who was still sitting by her mother's side. She hadn't moved much, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. Jack didn't know what to say. Words didn't seem to be enough. "She's getting worse, isn't she?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, her words filled with quiet sorrow. "I can see it in her eyes." Jack's heart tightened. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to admit that he wasn't sure what else could be done. But the truth was staring him in the face, and it wasn't kind. "I don't know, Sarah. I did everything I could. But if we don't get her proper help soon, she might not make it." Sarah's lips trembled, and she quickly wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I don't want to lose her, Jack. I can't." Jack felt a pang of guilt shoot through him. He had promised to help, and here he was, standing by, not knowing what more he could do. He couldn't stand to see this girl in pain. He had spent so long hiding from his own grief, pretending it didn't affect him, but this was real. The way Sarah was looking at him, the way she trusted him, it was enough to make even a man like Jack want to do more, be more. Jack walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'll go into town tomorrow," he said softly. "I'll find a doctor, someone who can help. You just have to hold on a little longer. I won't let her die, Sarah, not if I can do something about it." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt but also a spark of hope. "You promise?" "I promise," Jack said, his voice firm. He wasn't sure how he would find the doctor or how he would pay for it, but he couldn't leave them like this. He wouldn't. The night stretched on, and Jack stayed by the fire, trying to sleep in fits, but every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced with thoughts of Sarah and her mother. The uncertainty of their situation gnawed at him, but he refused to give in to it. He couldn't, not now. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. The first light of morning came slowly, painting the world outside in shades of gray and gold. Jack rose early, his body stiff from the uncomfortable rest he had gotten the night before. He stretched his legs and walked outside, the cool morning air greeting him as he stepped onto the porch. The hills were still, the quiet broken only by the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. He mounted his horse and set off toward town, his mind focused on one thing, finding a doctor. He didn't know where he would start, but he had to find someone who could help. It wasn't just about saving the woman anymore. It was about saving Sarah, too. If he didn't come back with good news, if he didn't find a way to help, he knew he might never see the light in the girl's eyes again. That thought alone kept him moving forward, pushing through the miles of empty road that lay ahead. As Jack rode into town, the early morning hustle and bustle was just beginning. People were opening their shops, setting up their stalls, and preparing for the day ahead. Jack pulled his horse to a stop in front of the first building he saw, a small general store, and dismounted, tying the horse to a post. He stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing softly as he entered. The store was small but well-stocked, with shelves lined with canned goods, dry goods, and a few medicinal supplies. Behind the counter stood an older man with graying hair and a thick mustache. He looked up as Jack approached, a slight frown on his face. "Can I help you, stranger?" the man asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Jack nodded, leaning on the counter. "I'm looking for a doctor, someone who can help with a sick woman. It's urgent." The man's eyes narrowed and he studied Jack for a moment. "A doctor? Well, you might be in luck. There's one in town, Dr. Harris. He's a bit of a recluse, doesn't take too kindly to visitors, but if you're desperate, he might help." "Where can I find him?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "Out past the edge of town, near the old mill. Just follow the road and you can't miss it." Jack thanked the man and left the store, his mind racing. He had to find Dr. Harris. He had to get the help Sarah and her mother needed. Time was running out. Jack rode out of town, following the road that led to the mill. The journey was slow, the road uneven and rough, but he didn't mind. He was too focused on the task at hand. His horse's hooves echoed in the stillness as he rode through the quiet countryside, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every step. When Jack finally reached the mill, it stood as an old, abandoned structure, its once sturdy walls now decaying and crumbling. He tied his horse to a nearby post and approached the door, knocking gently. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 50s, dressed in a worn brown coat and a pair of thick spectacles. "You the doctor?" Jack asked, his voice blunt. The man squinted at him for a moment before nodding slowly. "I am, but I don't see many visitors these days." "I need your help," Jack said. "There's a woman in need of urgent care. She's very sick. I'll pay whatever it takes." "Doctor." Harris looked Jack over carefully, then seemed to consider the request. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I'll help, but only if you follow my lead and don't waste my time." Jack nodded. Of course. The morning sun had barely risen above the hills when Jack returned to the cabin. The road had been long and difficult, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was getting the help Sarah and her mother needed. The promise he had made to Sarah echoed in his mind with each mile he rode, urging him to keep going even when his body screamed for rest. He had done it. He had found Dr. Harris. As Jack approached the cabin, he could see Sarah standing on the porch, her face illuminated by the pale light of the morning. She looked as if she had been waiting for hours, her eyes scanning the horizon, hoping for any sign that Jack had succeeded in finding help. Jack's heart sank a little at the sight of her. He knew the uncertainty she felt. He had seen that same fear in the eyes of many others, but it was different this time. It felt personal. He dismounted from his horse, his legs stiff from the long ride. "Sarah," he called softly, his voice rough from the dust and the heat. Sarah turned toward him, and her face broke into a mixture of hope and fear. "Did you find him? Did you find the doctor?" Jack nodded. "I did. I found Dr. Harris. He's coming." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. She took a step forward, her hand trembling as she reached for Jack's sleeve. "He's really coming? To help my mom?" "He's on his way," Jack confirmed, feeling a small sense of relief at the look of hope in Sarah's eyes. It wasn't over yet, but at least they had a chance now. Sarah smiled, the first real smile Jack had seen from her since he arrived. "Thank you, Jack. I can't believe it. I thought we were going to lose her." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, watching the road as Dr. Harris made his way toward them on horseback. The doctor was a tall man, older than Jack had first imagined, with a long, graying beard and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold the weight of countless years. His weathered appearance made it clear that he wasn't a man who had ever sought the comforts of city life. His rough hands gripped the reins of his horse as he rode slowly toward the cabin. Jack stepped forward to meet him, tipping his hat in greeting. "Thank you for coming," Jack said. "We didn't know who else to turn to." Dr. Harris nodded, his eyes scanning the cabin and then shifting to Sarah, who stood nervously behind Jack. "No need to thank me yet. I do this because it's my duty, not because of gratitude." His voice was gruff, but there was something reassuring in the way he spoke, direct, no nonsense. It gave Jack a sense of confidence, something he hadn't realized he needed. "Is she still in bed?" Doctor Harris asked, his gaze shifting to the cabin. Jack nodded. Yes, she's in the room just inside. Dr. Harris didn't waste any time. He dismounted from his horse, tying it to the post before making his way toward the door. Jack followed him, Sarah close behind. When they entered the cabin, the scene inside was much the same as it had been when Jack had left. The woman still lay in the bed, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Sarah's mother, her name was Marie, was still clinging to life, but it wasn't clear for how much longer. Doctor Harris moved quickly to her side, his experienced hands immediately feeling her pulse and checking her temperature. He muttered a few words to himself, shaking his head as he worked. Jack stood back, watching as the doctor took control of the situation. Her fever's still high, Dr. Harris said after a moment, glancing up at Jack and Sarah. What has she been taking? Jack stepped forward, motioning to the small cup of tea Jack had made with the herbs he had gathered. I gave her some herbs. I wasn't sure if they'd help, but I thought it was worth a shot. Dr. Harris looked at the cup, his expression unreadable. Good thinking, he said, but his tone suggested he wasn't impressed. It may help, but she needs more than herbs. We'll have to do what we can with what we have. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small vial of medicine, pouring a few drops onto a piece of cloth and placing it on Marie's forehead. Then he turned to Jack and Sarah. I'm going to need some time. Stay here. Don't leave unless it's necessary. Jack nodded and stepped back, feeling the weight of the doctor's words. He didn't want to leave, but he knew he had to. This was Dr. Harris's domain now. He was the one who could save Marie's life, not Jack. The hours passed slowly, with only the occasional murmur of Dr. Harris as he worked. Jack sat on a chair by the window, his thoughts racing. He kept thinking about Sarah, about how much she needed her mother. He couldn't even imagine the pain she must have been feeling. How had she managed to hold on for so long without anyone to help? Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. She hadn't said much since Dr. Harris had arrived, but Jack could see the silent hope in her eyes. She was watching the doctor, waiting for any sign that her mother would survive this. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Harris stepped away from the bed, wiping his hands on his coat. He looked at Jack and Sarah with a solemn expression, and for a moment Jack thought the worst. Her condition is improving, Dr. Harris said, his voice gruff but tinged with something like relief. The fever's starting to break. It's going to be a long road ahead, but I think she'll make it. The words hit Jack like a wave of relief. He could see the change in Sarah's face as well. Her shoulders relaxed, her eyes softened, and for the first time in days, a real smile spread across her face. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Thank you so much. Dr. Harris nodded, his expression unchanged. Don't thank me yet, she's not out of the woods, but we have a chance now. Sarah turned to Jack, her eyes brimming with gratitude. You did it. You really did it. You promised me you'd help, and you did. Jack gave a small smile, but inside he felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. He had made a promise and he had kept it, but it wasn't over yet. He couldn't stop now. There was still work to be done. Doctor Harris stayed for another hour, instructing Sarah on what to do next. He gave her a few more herbs to make sure her mother's fever continued to drop, and he left behind some medicine for her to take. I'll come back tomorrow, he said as he packed up his things. Make sure you follow my instructions carefully. If anything changes, you send for me right away. Jack watched as Dr. Harris left the cabin, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. When the doctor was gone, Jack turned to Sarah, who was sitting by the bed again, her mother now sleeping peacefully, her fever broken. You did it, Jack, Sarah said quietly. You really did. Jack didn't know what to say. He had done what he could, but it was Dr. Harris who had saved Marie's life. All Jack had done was keep a promise, and that was something anyone would have done. For a moment, the cabin was still, filled with a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the sound of the wind outside filled the silence. Sarah's mother was still alive, and that was enough. Jack stood up and walked toward the door. He needed to get some rest. He had done his part, but now he needed to recover. He wasn't sure what the future held for him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. As he opened the door and stepped outside, Sarah's voice stopped him. Jack, she said softly. He turned back to her, his hand still on the doorframe. What is it, Sarah? Thank you, she said again, her voice full of sincerity. You gave us hope when we had none. You gave me my mom back. I'll never forget that. Jack nodded, his heart heavy with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I just did what needed to be done." And with that, he stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the cabin behind. As he walked into the night, Jack knew one thing for certain. This time, he wasn't just a drifter anymore. He had found a place where he belonged.